Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the LEA Special Education Point of Contact monthly webinar for January 2022. Happy New Year. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. As always, you can download a copy of today's presentation through GoToWebinar in the handouts menu. And we see that participants are still logging in. We want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. We had some technology challenges with some applications that are updating here, and we had a hard time getting on this morning, but thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to jump right in and get started with our agenda. My name is Tiffany Ingram. I'm a policy analyst here at OSSE in the K-12 Systems Division, and one of the IDA monitors here as well. So our agenda is full today, and we will have announcements from our policy team. We'll go through some IP implementation for transfer students, that policy overview. We'll talk about just reminders around comparable services and SEDS and documenting services and SEDS for our related service providers. We will have some updates from our IDA monitoring team, some reminders as well. We will hear from our transportation team, and we will close out with reminders and announcements from our teaching and learning division. Again, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And I am going to turn it over to Christy, who will support us with providing those policy reminders and updates. Christy?
Good morning, everyone. This is Christy Weaver-Harris. I'm the policy manager in OSSE's Division of Systems and Supports K-12 in the Office of Special Education. I'm going to talk today a little bit about some upcoming responsibilities and some responsibilities related to transfer students. Next slide, please. So, 'tis the season for ESY. ESY certification is the process through which LEAs certify and confirm final decisions regarding student level eligibility and ESY related transportation. So this process helps LEAs to plan for summer staffing and programming, and it helps OSSE anticipate state level expenses primarily related to students who are in non-public schools, and it also helps us to plan for ESY transportation. This year's ESY certification date for summer ESY is Monday, May 2nd. I also want to remind you that ESY can be provided during any break in service during the school year. It doesn't just have to be during the summer. ESY is not summer school. ESY can be provided during Christmas break. It can be provided during such short periods as long weekends. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to me directly, but I do want to remind you that ESY can happen during any school break. It is not just during the summer if a student requires it. Next slide, please. So to complete ESY certification, an LEA must finish all student level ESY decisions and SEDS, and that includes for students attending non-public schools. And in TOTE, you need to be completing your ESY calendar, entering your bell times, confirming student level information for ESY eligibility and the ESY location, and you need to be submitting your TRFs. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do a quick overview of ESY eligibility, but let me know in the questions box if you'd like a more in-depth presentation on making eligibility determinations during next month's webinar. We've historically gone over this like every other year, basically. We know there's nothing new, none of this has changed. And I don't want to be repeating the same information for you if you're already familiar, but if you are not, please feel free to write in the questions box like, hey, we do need a quick overview on this. We know and appreciate that everyone is dealing with so much right now, especially with the return following the holidays. We're trying to not whelm you with more information than what you absolutely need. So a few reminders about ESY for our current context. ESY is different from compensatory services or compensatory education. ESY is provided for the purpose of preventing substantial regression, while substantial regression due to a break in service, while compensatory education or compensatory services are to address a past break in services or a past failure to provide FAPE. So I just want to make that clear up front. For ESY eligibility, IEP teams must determine on an individualized basis each student's eligibility for ESY and each student's eligibility for ESY transportation. But for ESY, you have to use the ESY eligibility criteria that you can see in our policy, in OSSE's ESY policy. And I'll drop a link in the chat for that in a minute. And by using the ESY eligibility worksheet that's available in SEDS. So on this slide here, high level, each of the 3 criteria, you're going to examine the impact of a break in service on a student's critical skills, the degree of regression that the student may experience due to the break in service on those critical skills, and then the time required for recoupment to recoup the critical skill that the student may experience regression on due to the break in service. So IEP teams, again, must make that it's an individualized student determination. You have to use student data to analyze and quantify the likely impact of that break on educational benefit, on critical skill attainment or maintenance. IEP teams are expected to use 3 months of progress monitoring data, which is why I'm talking about this in January. We got to start collecting that data now. If you don't have 3 months of data, you can use any relevant current data or information about a student. The requirement is 3 months. The caveat to that is if you don't have 3 months, use any relevant data that you have. So examples of data or information that you may have would include historical data of the child's rate of progress toward attaining a critical skill, historical data about the rate of regression that they've previously experienced on critical skills during a break, and then also like historical data on the time needed for that student to recoup a critical skill during a break. Other data could also include medical records or evaluations that speak to the nature or the severity of the student's disability, current developmental data that indicates like a critical stage of breakthrough or attainment of an emerging skill, and teacher or related service provider observations. So when we're talking about critical skills here, we're both talking about skills that the student currently has. So we're talking about maintaining that critical skill, and also critical skills that the student is close to attaining, right? We're talking about critical skill attainment. The student is really close to hitting a mark on that. You may want to consider ESY as a means to prevent the student from losing the progress that they've made in attaining that critical skill. Next slide, please. So again, we have resources available to help IEP teams make appropriate ESY decisions and to help LEAs complete ESY certification. So for more information on ESY eligibility, I would recommend that you see the ESY policy and the accompanying frequently asked questions document. For more information on certification and ESY services, please see the ESY policy bulletin, which we released last spring. And as always, if you have any questions about any of this, you can always feel free to reach out to my team directly at osse.dsepolicy@dc.gov. Next slide, please. So I wanted to say thank you to all of you for your help in disseminating the school year 2021 IDEA parent survey, which we put out currently we put out after the previous school year has ended, and that closed on December 31st. Our response rates this year were the highest they have ever been for OSSE, and your support and your assistance is really, really, truly appreciated. We also pushed out direct text messages to parents, and we're really successful in that. So thank you again. Thank you for your help in disseminating that to your parents. We're taking a look at the data now, and if we are able to share it back with LEAs based on N sizes, we're looking at the best ways to do that. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk a little bit about transfer students. This is just as much as this is the season for ESY. We also know that we see a good amount of mobility between LEAs this time of year, so we want to do a refresher for both your obligations for these students and how to document all of this in SEDS. Next slide, please. So your authority here will be the IEP implementation for transfer students policy, which is linked in this slide, and I will also drop a link to it in the chat. I'll drop links to both the ESY policy and the transfer policy in the chat. And this policy goes over all of the transfer scenarios, including in-state transfer and out-of-state transfer. And to be clear, an LEA is responsible for special education for a transfer student upon stage 4 enrollment if the student transfers during the school year. If the student transfers between school years or over the summer, the LEA is responsible on the first day of school for that LEA. So the important thing to know here, really, the reason we break it out that way is that means the prior LEA is responsible for ESY services. And I also strongly encourage you to use the early access for students with disabilities data application to see students who may be enrolling in your LEA for the upcoming school year so that you can better anticipate serving those students when they transfer in. Next slide, please. So first, an LEA must request records from the previous LEA, and this is for both in-state and out-of-state transfer students. You must request records within 5 business days of enrollment, and this includes asking for paper records. This is not just what you get in SEDS. The previous LEA must provide those records within 10 business days of that request, but if you do the math here, we're talking 5 business days and then 10 business days, and that's 3 weeks in school time. So we want to be making sure that we are making these requests for records in a timely manner and responding to them in a timely manner. And by a timely manner, I really mean as soon as possible. We don't want kids hanging out for 3 weeks just waiting on paperwork when we know that these students have needs and need services. If the student transferred from out of state and the LEA has the student's existing IEP from that state, you must upload that into SEDS within 10 business days. If you can't get the IEP, but you know that the student either receives special education services or has a disability, and that can be based on information that like the parent gave you, the student provided, you still have child find obligations, and you should be entering that as a referral so that you can get the ball rolling on the initial evaluation process. The question we often receive here is like, who's the referral source then? It can be the parent, it can be the LEA itself. If the parent tells you, yeah, we just transferred from PG County and we had an IEP in PG County. If you don't have that IEP, or if you can't get that IEP, enter that as a referral. So also for an out-of-state transfer, like after you get that student's existing IEP from the other state or other county, it becomes a parallel process. So you must both enter the IEP in the comparable services tab so you can start comparable services, and you must initiate the initial eligibility process because you're required to determine eligibility under district criteria. You can use that IEP and use the documentation or the information that you get from the IEP or from the prior county or the prior state to make decisions about that student's eligibility, but you have to apply District of Columbia eligibility criteria. And Rita is going to talk about the documentation aspect of this in a minute, but I do want to just open your mind to and emphasize here that you're doing both of these processes at the same time. Next slide, please. All right, so comparable services. The LEA is required to provide FAPE in the form of comparable services to transfer students who have existing IEPs. And you must do this in consultation with the parents, which usually means a meeting, and you have to provide the comparable services letter. Comparable services are similar or equivalent to those in the existing IEP, or for students who previously attended a private school, similar or equivalent to the services described in an ISP or an individual services plan. So a note here about ISPs. Right now, most ISPs that you will see for a student who is transferring that had attended a private school in the district is likely to only have speech services on it. So when you are doing the initial evaluation for that student, you want to consider what other services that student may need. Just based on the way that equitable services are provided in the district right now, it's likely you will only see speech services, but we want to make sure that we're considering the wider array of services that a student may need. And comparable services are required to start no later than 20 calendar days after receipt of the existing IEP. The background here is that that's based on like case law that says 20 days would be probably reasonable, but in a child's education, 20 days is forever. So you want to be providing those services really as soon as possible. I would look at this requirement as being a requirement to provide it as soon as possible and absolutely no later than 20 calendar days. Next slide, please. All right, documenting the provision of comparable services, just like all services, comparable services must be tracked in SEDS, just like I said, the same as other services. In-state IEPs are automatically transferred in SEDS, so you don't need the comparable services tab here. You should start implementing that IEP. If you think the IEP needs revision, convene an IEP team meeting. You don't have to redetermine eligibility. That student's already eligible under district criteria. For out-of-state students, you don't have to determine eligibility for that student unless you believe that there is an eligibility issue, and then you should be conducting a reevaluation if you think that is appropriate for that student. For out-of-state students and private school students, you must manually upload the documentation that you receive into SEDS using the transfer student intake process, which Rita is going to go over again. But again, for out-of-state students and private school students, you're doing that at the same time as you are entering the referral for an initial evaluation. Next slide. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Rita to get into the details of documenting comparable services in SEDS. And while she does that, I will be taking a look at the questions box to start triaging that so we can go over your questions at the end of the webinar. So please be putting your questions in the questions box as they come up. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks so
Great,
much.
thank you, Christy. Hi, my name is Rita Larkins. I'm with the Office of the CIO, and I'm going to be talking about how you document these things in SEDS. So in our next slide, this is just an overview of the process that Christy actually just explained. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you in SEDS where a lot of this information should go and the steps that you should be taking in SEDS. So when your student transfers from out of state, things to keep in mind, their IEPs are not automatically in SEDS, but you need to be able to bring the out of state IEP into the system. So you would do this by completing the comparable services process in SEDS and by creating that comparable services document. You will also be completing the eligibility and IEP process in SEDS. So that's what we're going to look at in our next slide. In the comparable services process in SEDS, you're going to work with your registrar to ensure that that transfer student has already been properly enrolled and they're able to show up in SEDS. Once that student is in SEDS, you can go to the comparable services tab and then start the intake process. You are required to complete all 5 sections of the comparable services process in order to complete it. In the next slide is step 2. This is where you're going to actually go in and create that consult letter. So you're actually entering the services, adding the specialized instruction and related services that are similar or equivalent to what is on the student's out-of-state, that existing out-of-state IEP. So you will be documenting the service as well as the amount of time and the provider. So you will have to assign a provider at your LEA for that service. Next slide. Next, you'll have to complete the transportation section for comparable services. And this is actually going to allow the team to determine if a student qualifies for transportation without having to wait for the full IEP process to be completed in 60 or 90 days. So this page looks just like the transportation section in the regular IEP process and really requires the same information, including completion of the transportation eligibility worksheet. Next slide. And we've been hearing a lot about ESY today. There's also a section in part 4 to allow you to capture the ESY decision from the student's existing IEP, and you'll be able to enter that information. And this page is just like the regular ESY process in IEP. So you'll see a lot of the same information, and it also includes that ESY eligibility worksheet. Next slide. Finally, you will be able to create or generate that comparable services consult letter. And that is going to include or capture all of the information from the student's out-of-state IEP. And that information gets provided to the parent. as well as a PWN for initial provision of services. So that goes out to your parent, and then you are able to go in and start your process of determining eligibility and also doing the IEP in SEDS. Next slide. So just some best practices for your transfer students. Asking for incoming stage 4 enrolled students if they have previously received special ed services. Finding that out earlier is more helpful, I'm sure you can agree. Requesting the records transfer as soon as possible. So if a student needs to have a record transfer, that you are requesting that as soon as you know about it so that you can receive that special ed record. And also paying attention to eligibility and IEP due dates. You can plan for your reevaluations, and also remember that if the student from out of state, your out of state student has an expired IEP, that cannot be adopted. So what you'll actually be doing is starting the eligibility process and not the comparable services process if it's already expired. Remember, comparable services should start as soon as 20 days after receipt of the existing IEP. Next slide. Okay, I think I've come to the end of the comparable services. So if you have any questions about that, go ahead and drop those questions in the chat. We'll be coming back and answering those. While I'm already in SEDS, just this message is really directed towards your related service providers as a reminder. Next slide. One of the updates that you will see in documenting related services is in the service delivery options. And we just want to make sure that folks are paying particular attention to the drop downs for delivered virtual and delivered in person. This does not default to any one option, so your providers have to actually choose the correct option. I know that people were in the beginning doing all in person. Some of that is being delivered virtually, so the providers need to actually select the correct option for that service delivery. And then also reminder, service dates should not be a future date. It should be the date the actual service occurred. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Rita. I know that was a wealth of information that Christine and Rita provided around ESY and comparable services and documentation of things and says for related service providers for our delivery of service. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to put those in the chat, and we are reviewing questions as we see them, and we will ensure that we have enough time at the conclusion of the presentation to also go through questions then as well. I am stepping in for Karen this morning around and providing the IDA monitoring reminders and updates, and just want to provide an outline of our IDA Part B monitoring and compliance activities. As you see, we are here at January 2022, and it is time for a child outcome summary. I'll share a little bit more about that data checkpoint in the next slide. In the spring, we will let's start our monitoring for around secondary transition requirements and reevaluation timeliness. In June, of course, we'll close out the school year with child outcome summary as well. And in July, in the summer, we'll be doing initial evaluation timeliness with a focus on 3 to 5 year old students. And Christy, I know that we have additional point that we want to make here around our monitoring and compliance activities.
Yes, so we have been hearing from you about the difficulties that LEAs are experiencing in getting evaluations completed. We understand that evaluators are really pushed out in terms of their timelines and availabilities. If your LEA has eligibilities that are untimely due to COVID concerns or due to COVID-19, really, please continue to document all required information in a PWN prior to the eligibility due date. That documentation should then be submitted in DC CATS during OSSE's planned monitoring activity window. The OSSE monitoring team will then review and determine if the documentation includes the necessary criteria for a COVID-related delay. So we hear you, we know that this is an ongoing issue. Please make sure that you are documenting these problems before the due date and that you are submitting that documentation into DC CATS during that monitoring process.
Thanks so much, Christy. Reminders around early childhood special education. I'm stepping in for Dawn this morning and sharing these links to some OSSE related resources as well. So for Child Outcome Summary, OSSE is conducting the January Child Outcome Summary Data Checkpoint. The purpose of the checkpoint is to confirm the accuracy of entry and exit data submitted in DC CATS. Upon completion of this data check, OSSE will notify LEAs of any noted discrepancies. Once you are notified, we ask that you make the necessary changes by the specified due date that will be outlined for you. As a reminder, the initial provision of specialized instruction must be documented in SEDS for students under the age of 6. It is expected that the provision of specialized instruction is consistent with the first date of stage 5 enrollment, as you are required to provide specialized instruction on the first day the student attends. For students deemed eligible for special education services later during the school year, the provision of specialized instruction must be consistent with the first day the IEP is implemented. In both situations, the LEA has 5 days to document these services and SEDS. Specific information about the requirements and process of documenting initial provision of specialized instruction can be found in the Dear Colleague letter and the tracking of provision specialized instruction presentation, which is linked in the slides here today. And lastly, the transfer of Part B referrals between LEAs and the notification of a Part C transition referral received from Strong Start or Early Intervention is an ongoing occurrence throughout the year. All transferred referrals must be documented in SEDS within 3 days of receiving a notification of an existing referral. The date of the notification is the referral date. The new LEA should begin making reasonable efforts to obtain consent to evaluate within 10 days of receipt. As a reminder, please revisit any past correspondence related to transfers of referrals and confirm appropriate documentation of each referral in SEDS. So for more information on this process and child outcome summary, initial provision, all resources have been linked here on this slide. I think for our LEAs who are servicing our early childhood students, this is a great time to make sure you downloaded this presentation in the handouts guide, because these links take you directly to resources that can be supportive of your teams in all of these processes. Again, if you have any additional questions about child outcome summary, Dawn's email is here on our slide for today, and you can feel free to put any questions in the chat and I can take that back to Dawn. She can follow up with you directly to address any of your LEA's concerns. I will now turn it over to Doug, and he will be providing some transportation updates.
Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Hope everyone is safe. Next slide for me, Tiffany. Hold on one moment. So as we know, right now we have COVID still running rampant throughout the schools and out the community. So we just want to give everyone just our exposure notification protocol. If any student that we are transporting becomes in close contact or becomes COVID-19 positive, just please notify us immediately so we can suspend that transportation for a period of time until that student comes back with a negative case, and we'll be able to start the transportation again. Once that you all are notified that the student has become exposed and possibly becomes positive due to COVID-19, just please contact the Parent Resource Center as soon as possible at 202-576-5000. So we can just temporarily suspend transportation services, and it's normally about a 2-week period. But if we have to go longer than that, then we can make adjustments to that situation. So it can either be the LEA rep at the school or the 504 coordinator to call us to make sure we either cancel that transportation or put it on a temporary hold. So if you want to contact the Parent Resource Center, you can, and also you can reach out to Ms. Donisha Cruz, who is a manager within the Parent Resource Center at donisha.cruz@dc.gov, or again, you could contact the Parent Resource Center. Once everything comes back good for the student, we will resume transportation. Next slide, please. And our favorite time of the year is coming up. We are getting ready for ESY 2022 and also SY 22-23. Those dates are coming up soon. We are currently configuring the system to prepare you coordinators at the schools to submit new bail time information if you are at a public charter school and non-public, and also getting ready for these students to receive transportation for those times. So we will definitely send out communication to inform you when TOTE is ready for you all to start submitting your school information. But while we're configuring the system, you can reach out to your school just to make sure that the calendar information is correct. And if there are any cohorts due to the uptick in COVID numbers, if you all decide to go back to a cohort kind of schedule, we are still able to, accommodate those type of schedules, and also any exception days or inclement weather or any holidays that we will run into due to ESY. Most of the time, that's just 4th of July. But the main thing is to make sure that we are getting the accurate data for our students, making sure that we're there. If they're still going to receive transportation at the location they're receiving it at now, or if the parent move, and making sure we have the correct information for the parents. That's some of the things that won't change in time when we get into preparation for ESY and also the new upcoming school year. Next slide, please, Tiffany. And again, just to show you our process that always go through when we dealing with certification for ESY and also the new school year. Who will handle the data submission and also the transportation preparation portion of things. The data submission aspect of things, the school will handle that with the calendars, making sure the calendar information is correct, and also again just ensuring that the student data is correct. So you can even go back and their accommodation as well, so checking SEDS and checking with the parent and communicating with them. And what our team here at OSSE will do, we'll verify with the school to ensure that the information on the calendars are correct. We also will make sure that the system is ready to go prior to going live, to ensure that everything is working well and you're able to submit the information that you have to. Certification deadlines every year for ESY is the first Monday in May, and also the certification deadlines for SY 22-23. Those are the first Monday in June. And certification, that just means making sure that you went through all the proper checks prior to submitting that transportation request and calendar for the student. Again, LEAs will submit data no less than 20 business days, which is 4 weeks to their first day of school. And as always, if you need us, you can reach out to the TOTE support line, 9 a.m. through 5 p.m. And that number is 202-576-5520. Or you can email us at dot.data@dc.gov. Next slide, please, Tiffany. And our TOTE training for ESY 22 and SY 22-23. These are dates. We may add more dates throughout the calendar. As you see, we have them all the way through. Well, we had one today, and I know we met with a representative from E.L. Haynes today. But as you see, February through May. And if you have any new coordinators that may start working at your school in between these training dates, just please reach out to us and we will we can set up a one-on-one training schedule for them so they can have access to the system. And as always, if you have any questions in regards to training, you can just contact us at 202-576-5520 or email us at dot.data@dc.gov. Again, thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I'll go through the questions, and all please continue to stay safe. Thank you, Tiffany.
Thanks so much, Doug. I want to share a few reminders and announcements from our teaching and learning team. Our Foundations of Special Education course for winter spring 2022 is open for registration now, and the self-paced content will start on January 24th for our online course 3, and that is focused on the assessment and instruction cycle. And then our online course 4 will start in February, and that's around evidence-based practices and instructional methods. So, of course, if you have any questions about our Foundations of Special Education course or any professional development around specialized instruction and all of those great things, Jennifer Carpenter is your girl to go to, and her email address is there at the bottom. In addition, coming soon, we'll have a Foundations of Special Education Micro-credential, and this will be there. This is very detailed, and you'll be getting POUs for all of this as well. But the first will be around IEP meeting observation and reflection. So this will be an ongoing course, and OSSE is partnering with Digital Promise to put this professional development opportunity available, put this together. And again, if you have any questions about upcoming professional development opportunities from our teaching and learning team, Jennifer Carpenter's email is at the bottom. She's jennifer.carpenter@dc.gov. As always, you can hear about more professional opportunities, more professional development opportunities when you sign up for our Teaching and Learning PD Bulletin. You'll be able to download this presentation and be able to subscribe to the bulletin that goes out monthly. It is a wealth of information and resources and tips for educators across discipline. So this is outlining all of our PD sessions, not just for special education, but in many other disciplines as well and content areas. So feel free to subscribe for this as well. I do want to highlight our secondary transition community of practice monthly meetings that take place this week, Friday, for our secondary LEAs. I would say this information will be beneficial for anyone who serves middle school and high school students to talk about transition for our students with disabilities. We will have a topic focused on transition, competency, scope, and sequence, and curriculum models, and we will have guest speakers from several of your colleagues across LEAs talking about and non-publics talking about how the models that they use in their LEA to support transition planning for students. So again, when you download this presentation, you'll be able to register for the next virtual meeting, which again will be this week, Friday, from 10 to 11:30 a.m. And if you have missed any of our webinars this school year or last school year, please visit our webpage, and that is the LEA Special Education Points of Contact monthly webinar series. Link here. You'll be able to watch our previous webinars and download any training resources and materials, presentations, and all of that was shared in previous sessions. Our next webinar will be February 16th, 2022, and the link here is free. You can download this and share this with as many folks. I know some people are having transitions in their school, and you want to make sure that all SPED's points of contact for your LEA is able to log on to this webinar. Feel free to share the link as needed. And of course, I encourage all of you all to complete our survey to provide feedback on our session today and any upcoming topics that you would like for us to present on or share information on with the challenges you may be facing currently in your LEA. We want to be able to use this monthly webinar as a resource and also a professional development opportunity. If any training needs are, if you have training needs and anything you want us to revisit or review, please put that in the survey as well. And I'll leave this up so you'll be able to scan this QR code. Even if you are on a computer, you can use your phone to scan this code and complete the survey. It won't take long at all. Christy, I do want to turn it over to you because I know there are some questions in the chat that we may have. And if you have any questions, we do have time for questions now if you want to put them in the chat as well for us to answer for you today.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions. I'm going to try and go through as many are as appropriate to share with the group. Related to ESY certification, we received a question that isn't there a deliverable due in SLED? Yes, there is some documentation that you must also put in the SLED ESY module. We'll make sure, we'll be sending the annual ESY memo to LEAs, and that will have the chart that you usually see that has all of the information that you're required to submit as part of ESY certification. And we'll make sure that chart is also in next month's webinar. We don't have the dates nailed down for everything yet, so I did not present it this time. So in the SLED ESY module, you are also required to input your ESY site locations, assign those site locations to students, and then once ESY starts, document ESY attendance in the SLED ESY module. In eSchool Plus, you also make sure that you have to make sure that you're creating your ESY calendar there. I received a question about guidance on providing virtual ESY instruction. We don't currently have on that. The expectation is that services would be provided in person, consistent with the return to in-person instruction. Generally speaking, if you are providing virtual, if you need to provide virtual ESY services because of like a quarantine situation, I would encourage you to do so only temporarily. And I would apply the expectations for virtual instruction to that ESY situation, including documenting the services as being provided virtually, as Rita described in the presentation today. If you have a student who received services in the district, moved out of state, and then came back, when they pop back up in SEDS, they pop up as being out of compliance, but you have an out-of-state IEP for that student. This happens a lot, we know. If the student moved out of state, you're gonna need to document that as comparable services. If the student came from out of state and has a new IEP, you wanna be uploading that as consistent with the comparable services determination, and also starting the eligibility process. You already have the information about eligibility, or you should. It also depends on how long the student's been gone. If they've been gone for 6 months, you likely have the information that you need to be able to make a quick determination, keep it moving. If you do not, if it's been like 2 or 3 years, you really need to consider whether you have the information available to you to make an eligibility determination for that student. If you received an expired IEP for a student, you should, it depends really. And the IEP transfer students policy addresses what to do with an expired IEP. If the student transfers in state with an expired IEP, you do not have to do an eligibility determination unless the student's due for a reevaluation. In that instance, you can just update the IEP. If the student is due for a reevaluation, you should initiate that reevaluation. But if the student is transferring from out of state with an expired IEP, you should continue with exploring eligibility. You should be doing an initial evaluation to apply district criteria for that student. We received a question about the dropdown for services documentation has virtual services for your service trackers. It does not include meetings that need to be held virtually because this is only for documentation of services. It's not documenting IEPT meetings. We did receive a question. What do you need to document in terms of eligibility timeline extensions? Do you have to specify the timeline that it was extended to, or that the parent agrees with extending the timeline? I would recommend that you document as much specific information as possible in the PWN. If the parent has agreed to that extension, yes, definitely document that in the PWN. We are taking a look at this documentation in terms of OSSE's monitoring protocols, not in terms of what is specifically required of you for like federal requirements or for like legal requirements. This is a show your work situation. So please show us all of your efforts to document that this delay was due to COVID and that you are working diligently to mitigate that delay. If you receive a student that has an expired IEP and you're in the process of completing the evaluation or the reevaluation and it's taking a long time, how should you move forward with the provision of services for that student? You must continue to provide comparable services in this situation. And I want to remind you that comparable services are similar or equivalent to, they can also be the same services that were on that student's existing IEP. Definitely make sure that you are providing services in the meantime. And you can always amend those services as necessary once the evaluation is completed. But make sure that you are providing the services that you believe that student needs in the meantime. We received a question about documentation in SEDS. If a student's transportation is suspended due to a COVID exposure, you do not need to document in SEDS if a student is in quarantine or is attending virtually due to a COVID exposure. You may document that as a PWN if you believe that it will impact the student's ability to receive FAPE during that time. But in terms of specifically for transportation, you do not need to document anything in SEDS. Make sure you're going through the transportation process that Doug described, but there's no documentation required in SEDS. I think that's all of the questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Christy. And again, please complete our survey if you haven't gotten a chance to do that as of yet. And as always, we encourage you to download a copy of this presentation to share with your school teams. And any additional follow-up that you may need from OSSE team, all of our contact information is embedded in the slides if you have additional questions for us. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and Happy New Year again to you. And we hope that everything is going well at your schools. And thank you for joining us, and we will see you next month. Have a great day.